Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials had feared, anticipated, and ultimately prepared for, a decision that unfolded not over weeks, but in hours, hours that reshaped the battlefield, hours that sent shock waves through the Kremlin, hours that demonstrated just how dramatically the dynamics of this conflict have shifted. What Russia did this week crossed a line that Washington had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with overwhelming force, and with a level of coordination that stunned even their closest allies. This is not the story of a country simply defending itself anymore. This is the story of a nation that has gone on the offensive and a superpower that appears for the first time in months, genuinely rattled. For weeks now, there had been signals, not from official government statements, not from formal diplomatic channels, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive. Yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Kiev this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military movements know the indicators: the repositioning of strategic bomber squadrons, the sudden activation of encrypted communication channels, the unusual movement of naval assets in the Black Sea, the sudden cessation of routine military exercises. All of that went quiet, and whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. The silence lasted approximately 72 hours. During that window, satellite imagery showed Russian forces conducting what appeared to be large-scale repositioning exercises across multiple blasts. Supply convoys that had been stationary for weeks suddenly began moving toward the Eastern Front. Fuel depots that had been operating at reduced capacity were suddenly being topped off. And most concerning of all, tactical nuclear-capable systems were observed being moved from storage facilities to forward deployment positions. None of this was announced, none of this was explained, and that silence spoke louder than any official statement could. Early Thursday, Pentagon officials detected what they described as unusual concentrations of Russian military assets, including hypersonic missile platforms that had not been deployed in active theater operations in over 8 months. These are the kinds of weapon systems that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, intimidation, or imminent offensive action. Western intelligence services didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Moscow was changing its strategic posture. And when a nuclear-armed state shifts posture without explanation, even by a small margin, every capital in the Western alliance pays attention. The revelation triggered an emergency meeting at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Officials from the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Poland participated in what was described as a no-notice consultation. Diplomatic language for a crisis meeting. What emerged from that meeting was a decision that would change the trajectory of this conflict. The United States, after months of deliberation and hesitation, authorized Ukraine to use American-supplied long-range strike systems against targets deep inside Russian territory. This was the red line that Moscow had warned about for years. This was the threshold that Western leaders had been careful not to cross, and tonight, that threshold no longer exists. The warning issued by Washington tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials, after classified briefings, described Russia's latest moves as provocative, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly indicative of desperation rather than strength. Moscow had hoped that its show of force would intimidate. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most comprehensive and devastating we've seen in the entire 33 months of this war. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of receiving American authorization to strike Russian territory with ATACMS missiles, Ukraine launched coordinated attacks against strategic military infrastructure. These weren't the cautious, limited strikes we've seen in previous months. These were deep penetration operations, precision-guided systems that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally alter the operational landscape. The speed of execution was remarkable, the targeting was surgical, and the message was unmistakable. Tonight, Ukrainian military officials confirmed that their forces launched precision strikes on Russian military installations, including an air base in Kursk Oblast that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was preparation for a major winter offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could launch. They hit command and control nodes. They hit ammunition storage facilities. They hit aircraft hangars that were likely preparing to support intensified bombing campaigns against Ukrainian cities. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's planned escalation, the logistics infrastructure that would have made it operational. This is what made Washington's authorization so urgent. Russia's repositioning wasn't just symbolic. It was actionable. It represented the kind of coordinated preparation that could have resulted in devastating strikes against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that, fully responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't target civilian areas. They didn't strike population centers. They hit military command posts. They hit weapons depots. They hit the fuel supplies that Russian forces depend on for sustained operations. Reports from multiple independent sources confirm that at least 3 major facilities were destroyed or rendered inoperable. Secondary explosions at one site continued for over 4 hours, suggesting that significant quantities of munitions had been stored there. This was not a pinprick. This was a statement, and here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Russia's latest military moves were designed to test the resolve of the Biden administration after months of perceived American hesitation. Moscow wanted to see whether Washington would continue to impose restrictions on Ukrainian operations. But instead, the opposite happened. The United States didn't restrict Ukraine further. They issued an authorization that was so comprehensive, so explicit, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. But today, Washington did. Defense analysts speaking with major outlets under anonymity described Russia's strategic miscalculation as extraordinary, a classic case of overreach triggering the exact response they were trying to prevent. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian air defense systems had virtually no warning. That timing matters because it shows that Ukraine has developed intelligence capabilities that Moscow severely underestimated. It shows that Ukraine is not playing defense anymore. They are taking the fight to the enemy, and they are winning engagements that Russia assumed would never happen on their own soil. As reports continued coming in throughout the night, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. All Ukrainian Air Force units carried out drone operations against radar installations, forcing Russian air defense networks to reveal their positions. A ground-launched missile systems targeted supply depots that had been established in the last 72 hours. A Ukrainian Special Operations Forces operating inside Russian territory reportedly destroyed communication relay stations used by Moscow to coordinate frontline operations. This wasn't just a strike. This wasn't just a response. This was a coordinated campaign. This was strategic disruption. And strategic disruption is the one thing Russia has struggled to counter since the early months of this invasion. For every advance they have made on the ground, Ukraine has countered with something that undermines the sustainability of that advance. Russia takes a village, Ukraine destroys the ammunition depot supplying it. Russia repositions forces. Ukraine eliminates the command structure directing them. This asymmetric approach has frustrated Russian military planners for months, and tonight it was on full display. Remember, Russia thought this war would last 3 days. They thought Kyiv would fall in a week. They thought the Ukrainian government would flee, the military would collapse, and the West would lose interest. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. The Ukrainian government remains defiant and unified. The Ukrainian military is stronger and more capable than ever, and the West has just demonstrated that its commitment is not wavering, it is intensifying. 33 months into this conflict, Russia controls less territory than they did at the peak of their initial advance. Their economy is under unprecedented strain. Their military has suffered losses that would have been unthinkable before February 2022. And now, for the first time, they are facing systematic strikes on their own soil with American weapons. This was never supposed to happen, and yet here we are. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Russia's latest moves happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary internal pressure. Military hardliners want more aggressive action. Economic pragmatists want a negotiated settlement. Regional governors want their conscripted soldiers returned home, and the oligarchs want sanctions relief more than they want territorial gains. Putin is balancing clear's throat these competing demands while simultaneously managing a war that has become far more costly than anyone in Moscow anticipated. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability, the repositioning of strategic assets, the threatening posture, the escalatory rhetoric, all of it points to a leader who feels cornered rather than confident. And cornered leaders are unpredictable. That's what makes the next few weeks so critical. Washington's authorization, now publicly acknowledged by multiple administration officials, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russia to escalate without consequences. State Department officials said plainly that Russia's military movements were inconsistent with any genuine interest in a diplomatic resolution. That is careful diplomatic language, for we see what you're doing, and we're not backing down. You don't usually hear that tone from Washington unless something serious is at stake. The Pentagon followed up with a statement confirming that additional military assistance packages are being prepared for rapid deployment. These packages reportedly include air defense systems, artillery ammunition, and significantly additional long-range strike capabilities. The message is clear. Whatever Russia thought they were achieving with their latest moves, the result has been the exact opposite. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky addressed his nation and the international community in a measured, defiant speech tonight. He said, we did not choose this war, but we will choose how it ends. He said, every strike against Russian military targets is a strike for peace, because peace comes when the aggressor understands that aggression has consequences. And he said, Ukraine is grateful for the support of our partners, but let there be no doubt, we are fighting for ourselves by ourselves, and we will continue to do so for as long as it takes. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become and who refuses to blink. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest moves weren't isolated. Along with the repositioning of strategic military assets, Belarus also increased military activity along its border with Ukraine. Russian naval forces conducted unusual exercises in the Baltic Sea. Moscow increased cyber operations targeting NATO member communications infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Whether that larger plan was a coordinated offensive, a psychological operation, or a genuine preparation for escalation remains unclear. But what is clear is that Ukraine and its allies recognized the pattern and responded accordingly. Defense analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a major winter offensive designed to capture additional territory before any potential diplomatic negotiations. Another is that Moscow is attempting to pressure the incoming American administration by creating facts on the ground that would complicate future policy decisions. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to test the threshold for nuclear escalation rhetoric, hoping to frighten Western capitals into restricting Ukrainian operations. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't hesitate. They didn't seek permission beyond what was granted. They didn't limit themselves to half measures. They struck with everything they had available. And in doing so, they demonstrated that threats of escalation will not paralyze them. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether the West will maintain its support through another winter of war. Ukraine wants to show that it can fight and win regardless of what Moscow threatens. Washington wants to prevent this conflict from spiraling into a direct confrontation with NATO, and Europe wants to prevent the destabilization of the entire continent. All of these interests are now converging on a single moment in time. The decisions made in the coming weeks will shape the trajectory of this conflict and potentially the international order for decades to come. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian military communications for signs of how Moscow will respond. They say initial intercepts suggest confusion and anger within Russian command structures. They say logistics networks are being hastily reconfigured to account for destroyed supplies. And they say Russia's decision to reposition strategic assets is likely part of a broader strategy intended to restore deterrence that has now completely failed. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is preparing for additional operations. Their response today, swift, devastating, and precisely targeted, sent a message to Moscow that escalation will be met with escalation. And it sent a message to Washington that American weapons in Ukrainian hands will be used effectively. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with their latest military movements. But what we do know is that Washington's authorization was timely. It gave Ukraine the tools they needed to respond. It signaled to Moscow that American resolve is not weakening, and it demonstrated that the Western alliance can act decisively when circumstances demand it. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 48 to 72 hours. If they escalate further, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase. If they recalibrate, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared to defend their interests. They have shown they are ready to respond, and they have shown that the Kremlin's assumptions about Western weakness were catastrophically wrong. And tonight, for the first time in months, Russia appears to be genuinely uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet, and when Russia is quiet, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully, because tonight, Moscow learned something they should have understood long ago. Ukraine will not be intimidated, the West will not abandon its allies, and aggression will have consequences. This story is far from over, but tonight, one thing is clear: the momentum has shifted, the resolve is holding. And the price of Russian aggression is rising higher than Putin ever imagined.